Welcome back, everyone. This is the presentation on the figure and the figurine, the representations of the human form, which will continue with the presentation on hygiene and the relationship to bodily functions and bathrooms and sink and toilets and so on. It is quite interesting to consider that the figure in ceramic predates making of ceramics in any other form, like pottery or any other aspect of ceramics. Humans made figures in clay, like those two here at a cave in France from the Neolithic period, way before they made vessels. This is a painting by Wright of Derby that he painted for Josiah Wedgwood, and it shows the invention of drawing and sculpture, so depicting the origins of figuration in art. It's an interesting document to be aware of for the fact that it was made for Wedgwood, and it shows how figuration started in art from the viewpoint of 19th century Europe. So the earliest ceramic object we have is this Venus figure from Dolní Věstonice in Moravia, today Czechoslovakia, which is about 25,000 years old. And we find example of those Venus figure, highly sexualized with large breasts, wide hips, and so on, in Mesopotamia as well, and in many other parts of the world at the time or later on. Those are Bronze Age female idols, and more of those. I'm just showing you a selection here of those types of figures. This is one from England. It's called the Bugdar Boy from the island of Orkney, and it is the oldest ceramics ever found in the British Isles. And here is an example from Malta. Two images coming from the history of Egypt, the god Kum making humans on the potter wheel. So the Egyptians believed that this god created mankind by throwing on a wheel with clay. Sumerian votive figures are quite interesting. Votives are meant to represent worshippers at sacred site and to continue the worship continuously. Figures from Crete, two of them here. And in Greece, Tanagra figures are quite beautiful. These female figures were produced by the thousands using molds, and they were bought cheaply and brought to temples as offerings and so on. Scenes of seduction, which we will see later in the sex chapter as well, are part of the figuration theme in ceramics. And on the right, we have a large Zeus and Ganymede figure in clay, in fired clay. The Romans mostly used marble and bronze in their figuration, three-dimensional figuration. Ceramics is a rare material to be used, and this is an example of that here. Here is another one from the 1st century BCE, and this is one of the best examples, in my opinion, of a life-size ceramic figure made in Greece. We've looked at red figure ceramic before. This is, as I've mentioned previously, the first time where we have a spatially credible and anatomically correct representations of figure. And this first appeared in Greek art in red figure vessels of the 5th century BCE. And this would, of course, have tremendous influence on the development of image making subsequently. It is only a bit later that such representations appear in other materials like marble and bronze, of which we have examples here. This is a vase from Roman times showing gladiators, and their names are also inscribed next to each figure. It is from Colchester in England. And of course, we cannot speak of figuration in ceramics without mentioning Qin terracotta army, made at the mausoleum of the emperor Qin Shi Huang, the unifier of China, for whom the country is named, and it dates from 210 BCE about. This is on the left how the terracotta figures are found in the ground when they were first dug up by archaeologists, but the color soon disappeared. They were not very permanent. And on the right you have a restoration of what they would have looked like at the time when they were first painted with pigments. Now, not very far from Xi'an and the mausoleum of the first emperor of China, there is another mausoleum for his successor in the Han Dynasty, the Emperor An Jingdi, who succeeded Qin Shi Huang. And in his mausoleum, we find thousands of peaceful, doll-like miniature army with wood arms and fabric clothing now disappeared, showing nude bodies with smiling faces, mostly males. And it's a very strong contrast because the figures are quite small and peaceful and beautiful. And in Xi'an today, we find reproduction factory where tens of thousands of those reproductions are produced and shipped all over the world. And probably many more were produced in those reproduction factory than were made for the emperor at the time of the mausoleum construction. This is a figure of Emperor Qin, and it is not historical because we don't have any portrait of that emperor, and this is an imaginative representation of him from the Ming Dynasty that is now being produced as a model at those reproduction factory in Xi'an. And then the terracotta army has had a lot of influence on contemporary ceramics as well. We have those terracotta tennis players. Various Chinese artists are using that format to make comments on political situations and so on. And the artist Marianne Ayerdal has made her own terracotta army with female figures in various situations and positions to comment on the transfer of male power to female power in her amazing work. And this is a photograph of a shop in Jindijian, China at the sculpture factory, showing the kind of ware being made today with sculptural figuration in ceramics in China. And then, of course, all the propaganda ware made at the time of the Great Leap Forward and the cultural revolutions, and still made today for the tourist trade in those factories in China. And this type of work also has a tremendous influence on the development of contemporary Chinese ceramic and Chinese ceramic from all over the world by artists who go to China to work, like Book de Vries making this Mao Zedong out of skulls. So let's look at many more examples from all over the world of figuration in ceramic going back very far in time, like the Yomon period of Japan from Neolithic time. This is a dogu figure. A bit later on from the Aniwa period, again, we have funerary figures that were inserted around tumuli tombs. The beautiful Tang ladies of China, again made as offering in tombs and found in large quantities all over China in the Tang period. The Tang guardians made again to guard the entrance of tombs and to scare devils as well as people who would want to steal material from the tombs. The very celebrated Tang camels and horses, quite extraordinary beautiful figures made out of ceramic and with glaze surfaces. This is a view of the underside showing how they are built and made hollow. Another type of wonderful figuration found in China from the Ming Dynasty on is blanc de Chine, which is white porcelain with no polychromy whatsoever, made at Dewa in the south of China, and they're really quite exquisite things. And they're often compared to work made out of ivory, but there is an example of an ivory figure on the left, and you can see that the ivory will crack and age and yellow with time, while the blanc de Chine figure from Dewa remained pristine and exquisitely white and beautiful without any change over centuries. So there are all kinds of figurines that were made in China as well, and a lot of them were made for the export market to Europe, and they often represent European types, like this example from Jindajian from 1740. And all the way to today in Gansu, figurines are made out of porcelain with beautiful polychrome decoration. Some example from 16th century France, from the Renaissance period, again by Bernard Palissy, a very influential potter who makes its presence felt in most of those presentations in various ways. This is again the work of Luca della Robbia from the early Italian Renaissance, very important artist and very important to the history of ceramic as well. This is the work of another member of the Della Robbia family, Andrea della Robbia, a Mary Magdalene. And another one of his work here, Prudence, from 1474. Now I have important selections of work in sculptural terracotta made by a variety of artists who may be very famous for other fields, like being painters or sculptors in other material, and or may not be known very much at all anymore to us. The first one being Andrea del Verrocchio, and many examples of his work, because although he's a celebrated sculptor in marble, in wood, and in bronze, he did a lot of terracotta work, of which those are some examples, and yet two more. And Andrea del Verrocchio was Leonardo da Vinci's teacher. So he's a very important Italian artist, and he did wonderful work in all the materials in which he worked, including ceramics. Another one is Donatello. Quite often those work in ceramics were made as studies for works in other material like marble or bronze, but often they were also independent objects meant to be completed as such. And here I have a few other artists who may not be as well known as Verrocchio and Donatello. The work of Antonio Bigarelli. Those people were more or less contemporaries, but for a variety of reasons, they have been more or less erased from history. Antonio del Palaiolo is quite a celebrated maker of prints, among other things, and this is an example of a study in terracotta. And then we have some anonymous works as well. This is from Faenza, a very celebrated earthenware city, making ceramics for centuries and centuries. A Lamentation from 1487, quite a small object, almost a miniature. And then here we have a deposition by Niccolo dell'Arca, made in Bologna for Santa Maria della Vita Church. And it is one of the most extraordinary sculptural terracotta groupings ever found in the history of ceramic, if you ask me. It's quite an amazing piece. Here are details of the work of Niccolo dell'Arca, and you can see the violence of the gesture, the movements of the vestment, the extreme expression on the faces of the figure. And in many ways, Niccolo dell'Arca was a precursor of Baroque Expressionism and development in arts that will happen only a century or more after his death. Guido Mazzoni is another very important ceramic sculptor. His work is in glazed polychrome terracotta, so that the work has preserved its color, and we can probably guess, and we can see somehow on those figures, that the work of Niccolo dell'Arca was probably polychrome as well, but it was painted, and the colors have faded or were progressively removed over time with wear and cleaning and so on. While the work of Guido Mazzoni, being in glazed polychrome ceramics, has retained its freshness and the quality of the color, and also the vibrancy of the surfaces he has applied. This is another one of his work in Naples. It's a deposition. And here you have detail of the work, and it is amazing work, I believe, and it has been more or less ignored or erased from the history of sculpture, and my intention today is to bring up the work of those people, and maybe the fact that they were working in ceramics has to do with their oblivion from the history of art, but it's quite interesting to consider their work today in the context of this presentation. Guido Mazzoni was a great portraitist as well, probably making likeness of actual living being, and those are three examples of that. He also traveled over Europe and spent quite a few years in England at the time when Henry VIII was a child, and it is believed that this portrait is of Henry VIII when he was quite young. In Spain, we have the work of Luisa Roldan, a female sculptor that again is not very well known and has been more or less forgotten by art history. She was known as La Roldana and worked in Spain at that time. And many other workers in all kinds of countries and places in Italy and in the Netherlands and in Germany and quite many countries all over Europe are working in ceramic in factories, like this self-portrait by Carlo Bertinazzi on the left, and another sculpture by a Dutch sculptor that is now in the Museum of Vancouver here in town. And the Museum of Vancouver also owns those small fragments of figures in terracotta that are believed to have been made by Michelangelo, although this is contested by many historians and experts. But the Museum of Vancouver may have in its collection examples of the work of Michelangelo. Recently, this small figurative group was discovered in Rome, and again, experts are debating whether it is the work of Michelangelo or not, but quite a few believe that it may be. And at Sacro Monte di Orta near Lake Como in Italy, there is a large number of those life-size biblical scenes and the scenes of the life of Christ that are all made in painted terracotta, and it is quite an extraordinary group of objects that are set in the landscape near Lake Como in Italy. An example from the Seattle Art Museum from the 19th century, early 20th century by another artist. And then examples of temples in India that are covered with terracotta figures that are painted and so on. And there is more information on this work in the reading I have assigned for this week. So you may want to look at it closely and maybe back references the visual material I'm presenting now. Another interesting phenomenon in India is that figures are built out of clay over wood and straw supports, and then at the festival they are paraded in the streets and brought to temples and so on, and at the end of the festival they are thrown into rivers and destroyed, and on a yearly basis they are recreated and remade by the sculptors who make a living making those types of works. But in India, one also finds very large-scale horses that are hollow built on site and then fired on site by being covered with straw and wood that is then set on fire, and then they stay there, weathering slowly over time in the open air. We have here a selection of very beautiful examples of figurative ceramic works from Africa. Those three are from the Nook culture. Those are from the Akan culture of Ghana, the Jeni culture of Mali. Again, we're not very familiar with the art of Africa, specifically when it is in ceramics, and probably the most extraordinarily beautiful and sophisticated ones are from the Ife culture of Africa, another series of those beautiful heads from Ife Yoruba. And it's interesting to make a connections between bodies and figurations and vessel making as well. And here you have an example of scarification on the skin of a person with the same phenomenon happening on a vessel on the left. And two more examples here of scarification vessels where there is a deep connection at the level of form and nomenclature, how we talk about pots. We talk about the foot, the neck, the shoulder, of a vessel, and so on and so forth. And here this is exemplified and stressed by the presence of scarification on those vessels. Moving on to Precolombia America, the Olmec culture is the oldest in Mesoamerica, and they made wonderful fat babies like this that I find extremely charming and beautifully realized and quite puzzling in their presentation and emotional power. Colima dogs from Mexico. It's interesting in a presentation on figuration to talk about animals as well, and this is the introduction to that aspect of ceramic figuration. We have example from Moche, Peru here, an anthropomorphic deer, and this man riding a whale. So just to bring to your attention various cultures of Mesoamerica, of Mexico and South America, where figuration is very important. You have the laughing figures, the Sorridente of Veracruz in Mexico, a Moche portrait stirrup jar, which is believed to represent an actual human being, and this is the only instance of actual portraiture referencing someone who had lived that we find in Mesoamerican culture from South America. An example of a Moche mold that would have been to make those Moche portrait stirrup jars. Example from the Shanghai culture of Peru, again, much more stylized and reduced in their representations, but of great power through that minimal approach to form and surface. I really like those Quimbaya figures from Colombia. You can really see that it's a slab of clay that's been made into a cylinder, then compressed into more or less a rectangle, and again a tremendous reduction of signs and markings to define still a very expressive type of body. A Colima pot carrier from Mexico and a pot seller from 18th century Europe on the right, combining figures and vessels in a very intimate and quite amazing way. 3 figures from Nayarit, from Western Mexico. Again, often Nayarit figures are presented as a pair, male and female, and as a group, and that's quite distinctive of that culture of Mexico. A decapitation scene here on a Mimbres bowl. We've looked at Mimbres bowl repeatedly before, and this is quite a potent scene of figuration. 2 examples from the Nazca culture of Peru. And among my favorites are those small figures from Jaina in Mexico. Jaina is a little island in the Gulf of Mexico that served as a cemetery for the Mayans. And these small figures with characteristic blue colorings are funerary offerings in that cemetery. And they're quite small, exquisitely modeled. Each one is absolutely original, with this very distinctive blue colors, and they're really amazing things. The Mayan, the Aztecs, many cultures of Mexico and Mesoamerica used figuration in their work with amazing results. One of the most extraordinary objects they made, and the Aztec made, are the figure of Xipetotec, where we see the celebrant wearing the upside-down skin of a human sacrifice. So a person would be sacrificed, and his skin will be removed, and then the celebrant, the priest at the temple, would put the skin of the dead body over his own and bring out the god Xipetotec, who was the god of rain and regeneration. And another example here of the figure of Xipetotec with a flayed arm by the contemporary American ceramic sculptor Dirk Stachke. Effigy vessels from the Mississippi, combining figurations and pottery making, conflated together in very powerful ways. Jaguar vessels from Guanacaste, Costa Rica, very beautiful use again of figures, vessel, form and surface, image and object, 2D and 3D, in extremely sophisticated resolution of that problem. The Lady of Tikal from Mayan time, combining those aspects again in great sophistication. I have now a series of slides with fragments of bodies, like this hand holding a vessel on the left, and feet and hand becoming vessel from the Wari culture of Peru. Another example from Mochi time on the left, while this vessel in the shape of a leg is from Iran. It's quite interesting to find that all over the world and in the contemporary world as well, in the work of Carol McNichol and Jill Crawley, people use figuration in a fragmentary way, just parts of bodies instead of whole bodies, to evoke emotional, psychological feelings and emotions. Those two examples are from Iran, from very ancient time. An example from Greece on the left and from Ottoman Turkey on the right. An Etruscan perfume bottle on the left, and another one by the American porcelain artist Adrian Sachs. A footed vase from Iran from 4,000 years ago, and an example by the American artist Marek Cicula on the right. One from Egypt and a Roman lamp. So it's interesting that, again, as I mentioned earlier, that we name vessel according to body parts. We talk of the lip of a vase, the belly of a bottle, the foot of a jar, and all of those use of body parts in those kinds of objects reaffirm that deep connection between bodies and vessel forms that is so emblematic of ceramic making. An example from Greece on the left of an African person, and on the right a black basalt Wedgwood piece from the 19th century. Those face jugs made in the USA mostly in the 19th century are quite amazing as well. And it's interesting to consider that the teeth of the figure are made with shards of porcelain that are then poked into the stoneware before firing. And it gives those figures tremendous expressive power. In England, the three Martin brothers made quite extraordinary work at the end of the 19th century. And again, here my intention is just to introduce you to many makers, many people, many cultures, so that you are more or less knowledgeable that they exist, and then you may want to develop your curiosity about the Martin brothers by researching them further, finding more about them, and gain insight into the history of ceramic that could be useful for your own purposes in the development of your artwork. Two vases by Van Brigel in the United States, and another one with a figure embedded in a picture form by Dalpera in France. I really like the terracotta sculptures of Clodion, and here are two examples. They're mid-size, maybe, like half a meter tall, not much more than that. They're exquisitely modeled, very beautiful, and he was a very important sculptor working in France in the 18th century mostly, and most of his work, although he also worked in bronze and in marble a little bit, most of his work is in terracotta. Many artists use terracotta to create sketches, three-dimensional sketches in ceramics, and this is the work of the great Baroque sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini. And his most famous work in a church in Rome is the Ecstasy of Santa Teresa, of which this is a study in fired clay. Fired clay, when it is used as a sketching material for sculptural developments, is called a bozzetto. And this is an example of a bozzetto by the neoclassicist sculptor Antonio Canova. And examples of that in the work of Auguste Rodin, the very celebrated French sculptor. And Rodin also worked at the beginning of his career at the Sèvres porcelain factory, and this is a porcelain vase designed and carved by Rodin when he was working at that celebrated porcelain manufactory. The Sèvres porcelain manufactory is also celebrated for what we call biscuits de Sèvres, which are usually unglazed white porcelain sculptural groups. And on the left you have Leda and the Swan, and on the right Venus and Adonis, also mounted in bronze to add to the richness and complexity of the composition. And at Sèvres, around 1900, Agathon Léonard made a series of dancers and musicians that are quite amazing, and those are edited. They're made from molds, and they still make them at Sèvres today. They're quite popular. Parian ware is a type of porcelain imitating marble, and it was invented in England in the 19th century. And you have two examples of it here: A Bride by Raffaele Monti and a portrait of Queen Victoria. And because they are slip cast in molds, they could be made in reproductions in large quantities and made quite cheaply and made accessible to a larger public for that reason. Staffordshire figures are also interesting for that reason. They're very cheaply made. They were made in huge quantities in factories all over the Midland of England in the 19th century. They're quite interesting because they are very polychrome, and at the time color was something quite rare in the life of people. They had very little access to color. And in most houses, those objects would be found because they could be bought for a penny, and they would be one of the rare source of color in the life of people at the time. And aspects of Staffordshire figurines is what we call flat back figures, where the polychromy is only on one side, and the back that would be against the wall is not painted at all, just to show you how simply and cheaply they were made. And this cheapness adds to the great charm of those objects, I believe. Some example here of bocage, which are figures in a landscape with a tree or some plants growing behind them. And also all kinds of current events would be inscribed and represented in figurines, like boxing matches and sport matches and political figures and so on. So they served almost as a type of news of the time. They were the internet of their days in so many ways. And they were also used for propaganda purposes and political purposes, like we have seen before in this Emancipation Society figure, and representations of Africa made in Germany at that time as well. So they serve a variety of purpose. One of them was a fascination with oriental, exotic figures and dream-like things, and we have an example here from Chelsea. So porcelain came from Asia, came from China, it was brought to Europe, and people were looking at China as a very exotic place, full of magic and unknown aspects, and this was reinterpreted in all kinds of ways in what we call chinoiserie in 18th century and 19th century Europe. The wonderful work of the greatest porcelain modeler in the world, Johann Joachim Kandler, working at Meissen in Germany. And the work of Kandler is of great sophistication and complexity and richness, and makes all kinds of references that are important culturally and socially and so on. So we may look at this work as just fluff and excessive bad taste in a way, but they are incredible embodiment of all kinds of aspects of culture, of the relationship between people at the time, the different classes, fashion in clothing, and so on and so forth. And they are source of information on the life of people at the time that are full of information. Kandler also modeled and designed the Monkey Orchestra, and each one of the figures represents a musician, and it's also a portrait of an actual person who was a musician in the orchestra at the court of the prince in Meissen, Germany. Other example of the extraordinary work of Kandler here in unpainted porcelain. And Candler also designed and modeled a large collections of animals that are quite large in size, and they were made at Dresden for the Japanese palace. Two examples here of this ware. They are often distorted and cracked, and they have flaws because they were quite ambitious, being basically life-size representations of animals in porcelain at the time when the technology of porcelain was in its infancy in Europe, and there was still a lot of knowledge of the material to be gained. One of his contemporary, also working at Meissen for the Japanese palace in Dresden, is Kirchner, and the figures of Kirchner's are recognizable because they are almost human-like. They are much more anthropomorphized than the work of Candler, and as such they are quite interesting. Other example here of the work of Candler, making animals on the left, and his source of inspiration coming from China as well. And speaking of China, there is this beautiful bird vessel from the Neolithic time. It's a very early object in the history of ceramic of great formal beauty and resolution, I believe. It's quite an amazing thing. More work by Candler. We've seen the work of Candler before, but those are two teapots and a little pug teapot on the right. I really like those nutters. The hand and the head is movable, and if there was an earthquake, they would start to move and let people know that some natural event was taking place. And just a few more images of interesting ceramic figurines made at Chelsea. Chelsea was the first porcelain manufacturer in England, and the work became very refined and sophisticated and ornate quite rapidly. Some example from Capodimonte in Italy. Other example from Capodimonte based on that painting by Jean-Louis David of Napoleon. So there is a lot of relationship between sculpture and painting and graphic design and ceramic forms as well at the time. Another important modeler is Anton Bustelli. He was working at Nymphenburg, also in Germany, and those are two examples of his work. You can see that Bustelli has much more torsion and gesture in his work than Candler does. And it's interesting to show you those three recent Bustelli type figures made at Nymphenburg in Germany, but with a surface decoration based on contemporary fashion designers. Three examples here by Natalia Danko from Russia. And again, just a brief selections of those types of ware to introduce you to that potential of figuration and the figurine, of which I speak at length in the reading for this week. This is an example of Stalin and Mao made by the Russian State Porcelain at the time of their meeting. And the last image for today, made at the Halak Porcelain Factory, which was where the workers were prisoners at the Dachau concentration camp. And those figures of sporting figures and soldiers on horses and various soldiers from the history of Germany were specifically made at the Dachau concentration camp for Hitler and the Nazi. We will complete this 11th week of presentation by this presentation on hygiene, the body and its function, and the role that bathroom has played in ceramic history, which is a very important role that has been more or less overlooked and is rarely included in histories of ceramic, but I believe to be central and quite important to cover as well. The first image is of a pessoe from Orvieto, Italy, from a red figure shard. What is this? What was it used for? That was long debated by archaeologists, and so many were found. Is it money? Pessoe were manufactured from pottery shards, rounded and with polished edges, made by the thousands, bought at the market and disposed after a single use. This is a vase with a peso in use, also from Orvieto, and now found at the museum in Boston. And you can see how the peso was used and for what purpose. So we find a lot of representations of bathroom scenes, people washing themselves and cleaning themselves. And again, those kinds of scenes are very informative about the mores of the people, the way they took care of their bodies, domestic scenes, the way the vessels were used as well is an important aspect of this type of work. There is all kinds of scenes of cleaning up and so on in this type of ware. Here we have two examples of vessels in use where a specific use is in action right now. This little guy taking a bath dating from Israel from 700 BCE. The oldest toilet with a drain is found in Akritori in Minoan Crete. It's from 1600 BCE, and it would have been flushed with water drawn from large jars nearby. So people found very early solutions for drains, for the use of water, for the evacuations of excrements and so on quite early on. This is an example of an evacuation drain in ceramics made at Babylon in Mesopotamia. Other examples of drains here in Iraq with stacks of forms and bricks making cisterns and drains and evacuation devices going back in time quite far. This is in Knossos in Crete, the queen's bathroom with her bathtub. We find a lot of examples of bathtub in Crete in Minoan time, and this one has 4 handles so that it could be carried and moved from place to place. I really like those two here with water references, with fishes, and you can see that there is a drawing of the water exiting through the drain hole of the bath as well. Another example from Mycenae in Greece from the 10th century BCE. So very far back in time, people were taking care of their bodies and washing it, and ceramic played a central role in the implements used for that purpose, and also for bringing water to houses and buildings and then evacuating it after use. And the Romans were great builders of aqueducts for that purpose, and this is discussed a bit in the shelter chapter, and some of you may want to research it further as well. Examples of Roman pipes here for the movement of water and taking the water from the aqueducts to homes and then the residue as well. They're thrown on the wheel, they're tapered, they fit into one another, and they create continuous pipes for that purpose. Roman baths often include ceramics in their constructions. As I mentioned previously, they're often brick buildings veneered in plaster or veneered in marble, and we don't always understand them as brick buildings, but they are most often of such material. Islamic baths in Turkey and all over the Islamic world also incorporate ceramics in a similar fashion than the Romans. I really like those little latrine and pig pen bowls from Han, China. Again, those are miniature objects made as offering in tomb, but basically when you go to leave yourselves, it falls into the pig pen, and the pig pen eats it and creates food for that cyclical nature of food and shit we find in human life. All kinds of designs for chamber pots and relieving vessels. An example from Greece, an example from Roman Pompeii, with this interesting ergonomic lip for supporting you as you do your business. An example of a communal toilet in Japan. Very decorative toilets from France, and you can see that the decoration is quite economical because the sides that are against the wall remain white and unpainted. It's only the visible parts that receive the ostentatious quite over-the-top decorations. So that's interesting in itself. All kinds of chamber pots found all over the world, and of course ceramic being an ideal material for that because it is cheap and it's quite hygienic if glazed and can be cleaned easily. And we have an example here of a bordalou, which is a female pissing pot. And the bordalou was popular at French court and was named for a long-winded preacher at Versailles, Father Bordalou, which obliged women to carry the commodity to church so they could relieve themselves during the too long service. And this is a bordalou made at Meissen around 1745. We have political chamber pots, so that if you didn't like a politician, you could insult him by using a pot with his image in it. This is an example with Napoleon inside a chamber pot for that purpose. And all kinds of humorous wedding gifts were made as well. And this pot says, "This pot is a present seat. Some mirth to make is only meant. We hope the same you'll not refuse, but keep it safe and oft it use. When in it you want to piss, remember them who sent you Twix." George Hoare made chamber pots with turds in them. They were quite popular. He was selling them for pennies at fairs. Chamber pots they come in a tremendous variety of forms and shape, and there are toilet museums in many countries of the world. They're always quite fascinating to visit, and they contain multiple examples of those types of wares. I really like this little guy relieving himself from England, and then this pooping Mao from China, which I got in Jindajan, China just a few years ago. So it's quite interesting to consider our attitude to bodily functions and how they are used for a variety of reasons, be they political or humoristic, to make fun of humans and so on. And here we have two Japanese urinals, one for the countryside and one for the city on the right. Bedpans are also quite interesting, and they were made in ceramics in the 19th century mostly. They were used by invalids contained into beds and not having mobility. So there are all kinds of ceramic implements related to health and taking care of the body under sickness and so on. And at Karlovy Vary in Czechoslovakia, they make a specific cup where the handle becomes a straw to suck the content of the curative water that you can get at that spa. You have a steam inhaler, you have a tile for the measurements of pills, you have a spoon for measuring medicine. There's all kinds of interesting implements made around taking care of the sick body. And here we have an example of pots to capture sickness. So the sickness was trapped into the pot, then it was thrown into trees to deliver the patient from the sickness. And those are from India, but similar principles are found all over the world in various cultures where sickness was trapped in ceramics and then discarded in nature to get rid of the problem. Pharmacies often contains large collections of ceramic wares with the name of the various elements and medicines inscribed on the ceramic containers. You have here the diagnostic and examination doll in porcelain. So you could go to the doctor, and instead of being examined by the doctor, you would point at the problem on the doll, and the doctor will come to a diagnostic with that reason for that. 19th century English porcelain urinals, more toilets of various types. Again, you would see many examples of that in toilet museums everywhere. This is one for a boat to be on a ship so that you actively pump the material out after doing your business. I have a section on Thomas Crapper in the reading for this class, and this is the logo of his company. and a little bathroom scene by Canadian ceramic artist Victor Sikansky, Moose Job Bathroom from 1970. And then this interesting selection on fountain. This fountain at the Paris Mosque, an ablution fountain for cleaning yourself before entering the mosque. And of course, the very famous fountain by Marcel Duchamp from 1917. And it's reworking by myself as an ashtray on the right. And here again, reworked as a salt and pepper shaker based on the Marcel Duchamp original and a prototype of it made in bronze by Sherry Levine later on. Vancouver artist Reese Terrace did a large installation with fountains, which are urinals that are connected to the water system so that water drips from them and collects on the floor and is recycled back into the sculptural installation. At Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, as there are in most male-dominated bathrooms in the world, there is a problem with pee collecting on the floor. And what they did is that they put a decal of a fly within the urinal so that the user can aim at the fly, and this has reduced the need to clean the floor by 60%. And here we have the extraordinary Robert Anderson Art John from 1964. It's in the collection of the Seattle Art Museum, and it's a very irreverentious sculptural work in ceramic using the bathroom in the context of art making and the experience of art and the whole political nature of art in its appreciation. The work of Wim Delvoye from Belgium with those shit tiles. And Wim Delvoye also created a machine where if you put food at one end, it is processed, and at the other end, this is what comes out. They're called cloaca feces. And to complete this brief introduction to hygiene and bodily function in ceramics, my own bathroom gesture tiles, 65 different tiles showing different gestures we make in the bathroom. And you have them here as graphic painted lines on commercial industrial tiles installed in a bathroom in a house. And recently I did a low relief versions of them in porcelain in Jindajian, China. And those are details of the activities that take place in such a place as tiles for bathrooms. And the very last image for the day is this autopsy table from a concentration camp in Germany that shows you that ceramic plays a variety of roles in cultures, and some can be quite destructive and violent at times. Thank you, and see you for the last series of presentation next week on sex and death as major themes in ceramic history. See you then. Thank you.